でも諦めない牙と拳握りしめてこの運命と明日の記憶いつ砕いて守るよ
Rinsuke smoothed back his purple hair as he walked down the street. The rain from last night had definitely washed out a lot of things. The buildings looked cleaner on the outside, but the gutters were filled with trash. He was very glad that clearing the gutters didn't usually fall under his job description. But it was a lovely day, the sun out and the sky a bright blue once more. His investigations were going fairly well, all things considered, though he was at a bit of a loss on finding out who the vampire after Mimiko was. The Coven boys hadn't helped at all, destroying the black blood who'd accosted her before the company had gotten to him. He was probably just an underling, though. Something would turn up. It usually did. His phone rang, and he reached for his pocket, pulling the device out. He looked at the number and sighed. He waited another ring before answering.
Jiro, darling, I see you got your phone repaired.
I'm not in the mood for that this morning, Rinsuke. I did, however, wonder if you'd be so kind as to come by the apartment this morning.
Rinsuke stopped in his tracks. He gripped the phone, imagining Jiro forcing him to tell him things he knew he shouldn't, or at worst, making him pass out again.
Well, Jiro, darling, it's not that I wouldn't love to drop by, but you see, I'm just so busy that there's not enough time in the day.
I suggest you make time.
His calm, almost cold voice sent shivers up the investigator's spine.
I don't think that's... well, it's not exactly...
I'm not asking you to divulge Jinai's precious secrets.
Rinsuke almost dropped his phone.
You're not?
No. Kotaro found a note at the door last night, and I wondered if it might be somehow related to the problems Mimiko has been experiencing lately.
Rinsuke had to blink several times to process what exactly Jiro was asking of him.
It says remember, along with something else, but the rain smeared the ink enough that neither I nor Mimiko can read it. It must have been written in blood.
The purple-haired man started walking again.
I suppose I could swing by.
He looked at his watch, then started looking for a cab. Maybe that was the crumb he'd been waiting for. The paper was wrinkled, the ink smudged, but Rinsuke had to admit that it did indeed say remember on it. And, just as Jiro had said, the smaller scrawl at the bottom was completely illegible.
And you say Kotaro found this on the outside door?
He looked up to have this confirmed.
Yes. Sometime late last night, though there's no knowing how long it's actually been there. I would say not very long. But I would not at all be surprised if there was blood on this paper.
Rinsuke pulled out a small bag and placed the paper inside.
You don't mind if I take this for analysis, do you? Maybe they can figure something out down at the lab.
He pocketed the paper, not waiting for the answer.
No, although I'd wish you'd just tell me what Jinai's hiding.
The investigator took a step back.
Jiro, you promised.
The black blood took a seat on the couch. He put his head in his hands.
I know. I just feel so helpless like this. All I can do is stay by her side.
Rinsuke relaxed, taking a seat next to him.
Isn't that what she needs the most right now? I can't just keep the suppression team on standby in case some crazy vampire tries to break in, you know.
I know.
He turned away. Getting upset would not help.
I almost wish Alice were still here.
Rinsuke almost reached to pat the silver blade on the back, but stopped. There was no way he could take away the frustration his companion must feel.
Speaking of the sage, where's Kotaro?
Jiro did not look up.
He's watching Mimiko. Last night must have worn her out.
Rinsuke looked at his watch, frowning.
Still sleeping? It's almost 11. Just how late did she stay up last night?
She went to bed around midnight, but she probably didn't fall asleep until after the rain stopped.
You must be so tired, Jiro. Staying up at all hours. Would you like me to send someone to keep watch while you get some sleep yourself?
Jiro finally looked up.
No, that won't be necessary. Kotaro's keeping an eye on her right now. He'll call me if anything happens.
Rinsuke stood to go.
Well then, I'd better get this to the lab.
He indicated his pocket with a pat.
Call me if you need anything.
He waved cheerily as he walked out the door.
I can always ask Kane to come over.
Jiro sat back against the couch. It was likely going to be another long day, and he didn't need some wolf hanging around either. If it weren't for his being more tired than he was willing to admit, he might have been tempted to go after the investigator and smack him for the comment. Sayuka pushed her glasses up her nose as she stood, back straight, a file folder in her arms.
And this is the full report?
The technician nodded.
Yes, that is everything that we have been able to determine from this sample.
Thank you. The agreed upon sum will be transferred to your account.
She turned to leave. The tech gulped when she turned and gave her a rather cold look.
Mr. Clock doesn't intend to use that information for anything illegal, does he?
She tucked the folder more firmly under her arm.
Nothing outside of the company. Your name won't even come up in the investigation.
The tech wasn't sure if she felt relieved or not as she watched her leave, even though the price was more than fair for sharing information. She wondered if what she'd said was true, that no one would ever find out that she'd leaked information to her. Mimiko glanced out the window of the cab as they pulled up to the hospital's main entrance. Jiro took out the appropriate fare, with a little extra while she tried to situate her crutches in a way that would make them easier to pull out.
Thank you very much.
He handed the money to the driver.
Keep the change.
Mimiko opened her door and struggled momentarily to get her crutches out, but once out of the cab, she quickly settled into the swinging stride she was getting used to using.
Come on, you two.
She paused to wave one hand as Kotaro raced to beat Jiro out of the taxi as he took out a rather large umbrella. Looking back, she noticed they were a good ways behind.
If you're going to insist on going everywhere with me, you can at least keep up.
Jiro smiled, amused. Her spirits had definitely improved over the past few days, he'd noted. The nightmares hadn't troubled her for the last couple of nights now, and it was more than nice to see her up and about with her usual energy. Kotaro skipped to catch up with the hobbling woman, while Jiro merely lengthened his stride, catching up to them easily.
I mean, it's just a checkup. It's not like I need someone to hold my hand.
She was smiling as she spoke, even if her breath was a bit labored from the exercise the crutches gave her. Jiro opened the door for her, following just behind as she headed to the appropriate office. He put up his umbrella as he walked in.
If I end up on these crutches much longer, I'll be just as strong as you are.
She glanced at him before taking a seat in the waiting room. Jiro smiled at her as Kotaro headed for the box of toys in the corner.
Kotaro, keep out of trouble.
The 10-year-old waved. Mimiko reached for a magazine on one of the low tables nearby, flipping through the pages, then put it back down. She fidgeted with her hands.
If everything checks out, they'll probably let me go back to work.
Would you like me to go in with you?
Jiro noticed her antics, trying to understand what was causing them. She shook her head.
I'll be fine. It probably won't take terribly long anyway.
He watched as she continued to play with her hands, twiddling her thumbs, and trying to find a more comfortable position to sit with her leg extended.
Something wrong?
His sudden comment after several minutes of silence distracted her.
No, not really. Just anxious. I've never liked going to the doctor.
Jiro reached over to rub her back.
Relax, Mimiko.
I'll try.
After a while, the receptionist at the desk called her name, and she struggled to stand with her crutches. Jiro watched her enter the back section without further comment. Part of him wanted to follow her back there, though, and he had to restrain it. Everything would be fine, and if it wasn't, he'd learn soon enough. A quiet knock sounded on the door of Zelman Clock's inner sanctum.
Enter.
He sat on his usual perch, the furthest sofa, leaning back against the cushions. He had one hand over his eyes, the other holding an open can of Coke. Sayuka pushed the door open, closing it behind her.
Lord Zalman?
She moved further into the room, her heels clacking against the tiles. Under one arm, she carried a folder, and, as usual, she walked slowly towards him, not bothering to hurry. The vampire sat up fractionally, removing the hand from his eyes.
Sayuka.
He smiled at her, causing her step to momentarily falter as he put down his can of soda.
What information have you brought me today?
The woman reached his perch and passed the folder to his outstretched hand.
These are the lab reports for a piece of paper found attached to the door of Mimiko Katsuragi and Jiro Mochizuki's apartment building during the rainstorm a few days ago.
Zelman flipped the file open and began scanning the contents. His expression didn't change as he read through everything, going back to a certain page once he'd looked briefly at them all. He looked up at his assistant, eyes bright.
And this report is complete? There are no mistakes?
Sayuka's expression remained neutral, her hands calmly at her sides.
I have the assurances of my source that this file is complete and accurate.
Zelman closed the file, one finger holding his place on the page that most interested him. He tapped the Coke can with one finger.
Most interesting. Now I'm almost sure of it.
He stared into space, thinking. The human woman continued to stand where she was, waiting. She had worked for Zelman for far too long not to know his habits. His eyes continued to glow as he thought, one fang protruding as his lips lifted into a malicious smile.
So, that's how it is.
He turned, his expression almost instantly neutral again.
Sayuka, I need one more piece of information to confirm all of this. You know what I need.
Sayuka inclined her head. Without another glance, she left. His words were dismissal enough. Kotaro stared. Maybe it wasn't the most exciting sight in the world, but he was bored. After playing with the toys and various human children for over an hour, he decided he'd had enough. Most of the children coming in now were keeping close to their parents anyway, and they were usually coughing or sneezing. But it did surprise him that not only were the children staying close to their parents were giving his brother a wide berth. Jiro sat with his hat pulled over his eyes, legs extended. Whether or not he was sleeping or just hiding his face was anyone's guess. But with his arms folded, it looked like he was napping. Kotaro still didn't get why the others in the room were keeping their distance, though. But then again, maybe it was because they were vampires and everyone else wasn't. Or it could have been their outlandish clothing, though he decidedly liked his outfit. He thought his brother's coat was pretty cool, too. But staring at his brother's hat was getting old, he decided, so he slid onto one of the chairs right next to him, the one Mimiko had abandoned when she'd gone back to see the doctor. He swung his legs from the tall chair, enjoying how freely they swung.
Brother, what's taking Mimi so long? She sure has been gone a long time.
Jiro sighed from under his hat.
I'm sure she'll be back in a few minutes, Kotaro. You have to be patient.
That's what you said 5 minutes ago.
Kotaro headed back over to the toys. He pouted as he went. Playing by himself was fun, but only for so long. The door back to the examining rooms opened for what had to be the umpteenth time. Kotaro didn't even bother looking to see who was coming out. It was obvious that Mimiko, or the doctor, were taking their dear sweet time. This time, however, Mimiko was the one following the doctor out into the main waiting area with one crutch under her arm instead of two.
Thanks, Doctor.
She clutched a paper in her other hand. Hearing Mimiko's voice, Kotaro immediately abandoned the toy in hand and sprung up in front of her.
Mimi, you're finally done.
The girl chuckled as the doctor closed the door behind her.
I'm sorry it took so long.
Jiro pushed his hat back up where it belonged, then went over to join them. He noted the absence of one crutch and that the brunette was wearing a different brace, one that seemed a bit more flexible, and she was now standing on both feet instead of having the injured leg tucked behind.
It wasn't a problem. I was able to catch a quick nap, and I think Kotaro made a few new friends.
Yeah, but their parents didn't seem to like it.
Kotaro folded his arms in disapproval.
Especially not when I showed them my fangs.
Mimiko blinked at him, not sure how to respond to that.
Okay then. Shall we be off? I need to drop this off by the office.
She held up the paper for emphasis.
It's a limited work release. No heavy lifting or strenuous activity, that kind of thing.
Kotaro looked thoughtful as he followed the two out of the building.
So, does that mean you can go back to work now?
Mimiko smiled, her crutch swinging far more easily now that it was just a slight support instead of a complete one. Walking still hurt a bit, though, and her knee was jarred with every step, but it was definitely nowhere near as bad as it had been.
Probably.
Yay!
Kotaro zoomed around while Jiro waved down a cab, his umbrella held high against the afternoon sun. Mimiko was always happier when she had something to do. She watched Kotaro running around, now chasing a dragonfly.
At least someone's happy.
Jiro paused, a taxi pulling up to the curb.
Something wrong?
He opened the cab's door for her, and she got into the vehicle, stowing her crutch at her feet.
No, I just have a lot on my mind. I'm gonna have a ton of catching up to do.
Jiro smiled slightly at her moan. At least it was nothing worse than that.
Kotaro, we're leaving.
He looked around for his little brother as he took a seat inside, folding the umbrella. The younger vampire ran over and slid onto the seat right behind him while he gave the address. The driver tipped his cap and put the car into gear, one fang showing between his smiling lips. The front of the building faced out from the cemetery like any other building. Jiro looked out as their cab pulled up to the doors. If he hadn't known better, he would have thought nothing of it, or about what was inside. But since he'd come to know Mimiko, he learned that there was definitely more on the inside than what was presented, like so many things in life. Jiro again paid for the fare while Mimiko got out, Kotaro behind her. Pushing his umbrella out ahead of him, Jiro followed after. He sincerely hoped this was their last errand. Even though the day had been productive, he still thought she should be resting, despite his current observations. Mimiko certainly moved more freely now that she only had the one crutch to deal with, he noted, as he watched the spunky brunette striding towards the main entrance. Perhaps being able to walk more freely was the main reason, but it pleased him to see her acting even more herself after such a trying week. He hoped the whole ordeal was over, but experience told him to keep an open eye because one never knew what would happen. And there was still the curious detail of that note found on their apartment door. Rinsuke hadn't gotten back with him about that yet. One thing at a time, he supposed. Mimiko entered the building, heading towards the offices instead of her usual work area. It was a little weird to be going to work without actually going to work, she decided, but shrugged it off. She'd probably drop in to say hi on her way out anyway, so it was almost as good. Jiro followed the young woman as she entered a part of the building he normally didn't get to see. It was like its own little world apart from the other areas he'd previously visited. Kotaro seemed equally impressed with the decor, his eyes practically bulging as they walked.
Oh, wow.
He looked around the impressive reception area of the office suite with the usual childlike delight.
It's almost like Selman's house.
He immediately headed to one of the sofas to try it out for bounciness. Mimiko smiled at the youth's energy but continued to the receptionist's desk.
Hey, Kichi.
She greeted the woman sitting behind the desk with a slight wave.
Is the chief in?
Kichi looked up from her notes as she put down the phone she'd been holding.
Hey, Mimiko. Let me check.
She pushed a button on the intercom.
Chief Shogo, Mimiko Katsuragi here to see you.
There was no response. Instead, one of the office doors was pushed open and the chief himself walked out.
Mimiko!
He walked over to his foster daughter, giving her a slightly awkward hug from the right.
I was going to come visit you after I was done here.
Mimiko returned the half-hug, then quickly straightened. She was torn between being professional or casual. Instead of worrying about it, she took out the paper she'd been given at the hospital.
I was told to give you this.
She handed the note to her boss. Janai took the paper and quickly scanned it.
Fit for light duty.
He rubbed his chin. His thoughts roamed to the various reports he'd received lately, most particularly the one from the lab, courtesy of Rensuke. Mimiko stared at him, waiting, wondering why he hesitated.
Well?
She was tempted to tap her foot, but didn't. Instead, she gripped her hand more tightly around her crutch. The chief glanced over to Jiro, then back to Mimiko. As much as he wanted to keep her out of the line of any danger, he was also aware that regardless of how he might try to protect her, she was strong-willed and would go out of her way to do whatever she felt necessary.
You can come back to work, but with light duty only. And Jiro will start immediately as your closer instead of waiting as previously agreed.
Ignoring her crutch, Mimiko jumped into a hug for her foster father.
Thank you.
For a brief moment, she was a young child again, gaining the approval from her father for doing something good. Her smile was huge. Janai gently squeezed her shoulder, curbing her enthusiasm ever so slightly.
I think your fellow compromisers have missed you. Why don't you guys say hello? Especially Habari. She was beginning to wonder if you were dead.
He chuckled, trying to keep the mood light. Mimiko let her foster father go and hobbled off toward her usual office to spread the good news. Kotaro, sensing her happiness, decided to follow.
Yay! Mimi gets to work again!
Jiro's expression was unreadable as he watched Mimiko's displays of affection to her foster father. She was still so much a child at heart, he decided, watching her head out to say hello to her friends. But he waited, knowing there was more coming from Janai, and he wasn't disappointed.
Jiro, a moment please.
He pulled the vampire aside as he watched Mimiko and Kotaro, making sure they were out of earshot before saying anything else. Jiro waited respectfully, also keeping an eye on the pair until they had turned the corner. Using his connection with his brother, he continued to monitor, paying more attention than usual to his younger brother's mood. Janai ran a hand through his hair as he let out his breath.
Thank you for waiting. I just didn't think Mimiko needed to hear this quite yet.
He looked around to make sure no one else was paying them any attention.
She's been through so much lately, and there hasn't been time really to give her a proper vacation. And with this business going on.
Jiro could hear the strain in the chief's voice as he spoke, not just as a boss, but also as a father.
I understand. I haven't forgotten my promise, and I'm doing my best to keep an eye on her, troublesome as it is sometimes.
He smiled wryly. Janai met his eyes.
You have no idea how much that means to me. And although I know she'll resent what I'm asking you to do, I would rather see her safe and suffer some minor inconveniences than fall victim through neglect. I want you to stick to her regardless of what she may or may not say or do. Don't let her out of your sight for even a moment.
Jiro's usually smooth face was now lined with a frown.
I expect you received word about the mysterious paper then. Have they managed to decipher the other message, or where it came from?
Janai nodded, his eyes going hard.
We know where it came from, at least the general area. We also know that it was sent by a vampire. Unfortunately, I'm fairly certain they wanted us to know a Black Blood sent it. It was almost too easy to tell.
He took another quick look around. Several company employees were loitering in the hall.
Why don't we finish talking about this in my office where it's a bit more private? This way,